Hello, welcome to Jazz Is.
Jazz Is
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zach O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
Styles within jazz can sometimes show up in a lot of different places. They can show up as part of one form and also be an influence to another form. And the nature of the sort of Part 3 is about jazz and not jazz and the continuum in between. As we talk about this history, we're going to do a little deconstructing of the framework of the family tree because in some ways it fails us. There's a lot more nuance. It's a lot messier in ways that a tree cannot support. And I'm going to offer a new framework for ways that you might be able to think about this history that allows for us filling in some of the gaps and also allows for a lot of space for it to morph and change over time as context often does to history. So this family tree model, which in a lot of ways can be very useful because it talks about roots and it talks about fruits, it's also very vertical. And so it can sometimes create a hierarchy in our sense of what the history is. It places the African elements at the root, but it also places the African elements at the bottom, all right? And what we know about is movement stays in our body as cellular memory. And so it's actually not pushed down at the bottom. It's very present in actual jazz dancing. We also know that styles within jazz can sometimes show up in a lot of different places. They can show up as part of one form and also be an influence to another form. And the nature of the sort of linearness of a tree and its branches and even its offshoots of those branches does not allow for the confusion of seeing a form show up here and there and there and there. And the tree positions all forms as being equal coming out of that root. And if we're looking at the continuum between what is jazz and what is not jazz, it gets very confusing to put, say, a musical theater jazz style next to Lindy Hop, as if to say they are equally representing jazz, when one truly has the roots and the elements showing up, and the other has influences from, but it's not readily available on the surface to be recognized as jazz. And so I'd say this tree could be a useful starting point, but it's really helpful for us to maybe look beyond the limitations of what that framework is when we're thinking about jazz. So what I want to offer to you is this framework of what I call jazz to not jazz. And it sort of offers some different categories that we might be able to drop in different styles and techniques on the continuum of what is jazz and what is not jazz. We know that Lindy hopping and solo jazz is jazz, unequivocal. It is the root. It is the thing that forms it. It's where we recognize all those elements from. After that, I'd say we have things that are jazz adjacent, which is maybe they don't call themselves jazz, but those elements are still really, really present on the surface. And so when you look at a lot of house dancing and some forms of hip hop, you absolutely see what Lindy hoppers are doing. And there's actually a whole movement around that hybrid of like things that are club dancing and things that are Lindy hop and how they actually share a lot of the same vocabulary. So we have jazz adjacent. Next, I would say we have what I call jazz informed. And what that means is jazz that has a deep resonance with those elements, that you see that those elements have played into the way that the dancing has developed and evolved, but are maybe sort of like, you know, a cousin to the jazz dancing as opposed to the actual sort of nuclear family of jazz dance. Next, I'd say we have jazz influenced, which is things that are jazzy, but maybe the elements are not fully present, but there's some aspects of it. You know, maybe you do have a little bit of angularity. Maybe you do have that aesthetic of the cool present, but it's another step removed from the jazz dancing, from things that are true jazz. Next, I would say we have jazz inspired, which is things that really love jazz dancing, see the jazz dancing and want to emulate parts of it, but have none of those elements present, right? And so it's inspired by the jazz dancing, but it's not actually jazz. There's a lot of things I think fall under that category. And again, you can love them, but it's important that we contextualize them. And then lastly, I would say we have not jazz, right? Things that are not jazz at all. Maybe are using the term jazz, but nothing of the elements is there, nothing of the inspiration is there, nothing of the information is there, nothing that makes it adjacent to is present. It's just not jazz. And so I offer this framework to say, there's a continuum of things and the way that the tree does not allow for. The tree says all things are equal, all things come from the root. And what I'm saying is all things aren't actually coming from the root. They might be inspired by the root. They might be called to move because they got a taste of that root, but they're not actually from the root, right? And they might be incredible dancing, innovative choreography, but they're not from the root. And by naming this thing, it allows the root to have its rightful place in the history when for decades it was completely displaced from that history. And I say this as someone who taught a different form of jazz history for a long time because that was what I was taught. I was not taught about the Frankie Mannings and the Norma Millers. Instead, I was taught about the Jack Coles and the Luigis and the Matt Maddixes. And that is an ahistorical narrative around the history and the origin story of jazz dance. What I want to leave you with in this part 3 is to talk about where the jazz dancing is happening right now, today. Where can you find it? Who is doing it? There are a number of artists who are very much informed, influenced, adjacent to everything along that continuum. And then there are folks who are doing the actual jazz dancing, the Lindy hopping, and the solo jazz. And so I want to point you to artists like the brain trust of the performance called Swing Out. I'm very happy to be a creative advisor on that piece. Swing Out is this amazing evening length piece that's centered all around Lindy Hop and solo jazz, and it has a live band that performs it. And this is a collection of artists who were some of the greatest Lindy Hoppers of our day, and also a great band, the Eyal Vilner Big Band, plays behind them. Great singer, great musicianship, and you get this sense of what would it mean to be in the contemporary ballroom culture, ballroom meaning Lindy Hop ballroom culture of today. And these are artists who are actually quite famous around the globe because there is a global Lindy Hop scene. And so if you're inspired by Swing Out, know that you can go to any number of countries in this world and find a Lindy Hop scene. You can go to Korea, you can go to Sweden, you can go to France, you can definitely come to New York. Lindy hopping is alive and well, and it's all over the country, all over the world, with great thanks to all of those early architects who kept it alive by going abroad and teaching this dancing long after its heyday. I also want to point you to a production that, full disclosure, I happen to be involved in, but it's fantastic. It's called Latasha Barnes Presents the Jazz Continuum. And what Latasha has done is created an offering. We don't call it a performance, we call it an offering that shows you the relationship between Lindy Hop and solo jazz into line dances and party dances, into hip hop and house and light feet and Chicago footwork and whatever city we happen to be in, us bringing in whatever the social dances of that town. All of that shows that there is a relationship between these dance forms, and that those elements that make up the elements of jazz dancing never went away. They might have been called something else, but they are in the cellular memory of Black social dancing. Other folks to keep your eye on, I want to point you to an artist named Michelle Gibson. She is from New Orleans, and she is a second line grand marshal. She has a technique called buckshot technique, and it is based on the kind of procession that you do at a second line funeral and procession. Incredible dancing, all of those elements are present, but they show up differently. And that's one of the really fascinating things about this jazz dancing is that the elements can show up in different ways in the body, but they're still very present. So the footwork that you see Michelle Gibson do as a second line grand marshal is related to, but is different from the footwork you might see from a solo jazz dancer, which is also different from the footwork you would see in a Chicago footwork dancer. But it's all still footwork and it's all still related. I also want to shout out my friend, my dear colleague, Mr. Sekou McMiller, who is one of the great Latin jazz dancers of our time. And though we didn't talk about it at length, I want to say that the influences of Latin jazz music and Latin culture into jazz dancing goes back many, 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 many decades. And we see this development of a whole style of Latin jazz dancing that again embraces that sense of footwork and angularity and the partnering that we see in Lindy hopping. All of these things keep showing up again. It's a different way of using the body, but it is still jazz 100%. Lastly, I want to leave you with the folks who I think are the children of Catherine Dunham, which is to say they are dealing in hybrid forms. They have influences coming from lots of different kinds of dancing, but there is a jazz root there. And so I'm talking about folks like Camille Brown. I'm talking about artists like Urban Bushwomen. I'm talking about Diane McIntyre, who is still making work today. It's important that you know that the movement shows up differently, but there is absolutely a jazz root there. Lastly, it's important that you know that tap dance is alive and well, and there are tap dancers, voluminous amount, a family of tap dancers all around the world. I always say like tap dancers are thick as thieves. They're like this massive connection of people where everybody knows everybody and everyone's danced with everybody at countless numbers of events. And so there are a number of dancers I can name, but in this moment, because we don't talk about the women enough, I want to throw out some names of the women who are tap dancing. I'm talking about folks like Ayodele Cassell and Brene Ali and Quinn Johnson and Michelle Dorrance. And specifically, a lot of these women are the direct disciples of one of our great tap and jazz dancers, Mabel Lee. She took them under her wing and trained them when they were very young people, and now they are carrying on her legacy. And so even though we talk about tap and jazz as being separate, know that they are still actually one dance. They share a root, they share vocabulary, and like the jazz dancing that's happening around the world, across the globe, tap dance is alive and well. So I hope that this three-part series on this family tree has been informative. Again, it's complicated, it's messy. The history continues to be unearthed as we right some wrongs, as we correct some ahistorical narratives. But know that regardless of what we call it, the way that we name it, the way we talk about it, the true history lies in the bodies of the dancers. They are the ones that carry it with them. They are the real roots and fruits of the family tree, and you can find that dancing happening every day in every landscape, in every city and every country, because jazz is our great offering that comes from America. It's our post-colonial indigenous dance form, and it is our greatest gift. We're really fortunate that there are a number of artists who are making contemporary work where they still place jazz at the center of it. I was really delighted a few years ago when I saw a commercial by the great R&B artist Usher that was sort of set in this speakeasy, and he takes you through time with all this different kind of dancing. And right there in the center of it is one of our great culture bearers, the keeper of the flame, the man who has all the vocabulary, Chester Whitmore. I also want to encourage you to keep your eye out for the Soul Train musical, which is choreographed by Camille Brown. Camille has her hand in a number of projects in which jazz continues to show up. But in this particular musical, you see the real party dances of this important cultural artifact that was Soul Train. You see some of the best dancers of our day who are channeling their forefathers and mothers, the people who taught them how to dance by watching television. Jon Batiste has this wonderful music video for his song called I Need You, and I was so delighted to see some wonderful jazz dancing in that, and to present it as something that is contemporary, not a throwback. Sometimes when we talk about this way of dancing, we talk about it as if it's old-fashioned, but again, I want to tell you that it's happening right now across the world every day. Dancers are making their living doing this kind of dancing, and Jon Batiste, who again is one of our great leaders maintaining the culture for jazz, put that kind of dancing front and center in his music video. How about Syncopated Ladies, Chloe and Maude Arnold, who are bridging that gap between the traditions that they carry and placing it very solidly in a contemporary form of tap dancing. They bring the past and the present together in this work, and they're selling out theaters around the world. And so, again, while we talk about jazz as being something of the past, know that jazz is never going to be past. It's present in every single thing that we do. It is the foundation of our culture in this country. It is what creates our understanding of how to recognize and how to appreciate dancing that happens on stages. All of that comes from the roots and the contributions of the artists who made jazz. We're so fortunate that jazz is with us in the past, with us in the present, and will be with us in the future.